Black activists' bold move reshapes local policy. The crowd's angry voices rose to a crescendo outside City Hall. Eleanor Washington, her gray hair gleaming in the afternoon sun, stood resolute on the steps, facing down the police line that separated her from the mayor's office. Behind her, hundreds of protesters held signs demanding justice, their chants echoing off the marble facade. "You can't silence us anymore," Eleanor's voice carried across the plaza, powerful despite her 70 years. 50 years I've lived in this town, and I won't let you bulldoze our history." Police Captain James Miller stepped forward, his weathered face grim beneath his cap. "Ms. Washington, you don't have a permit for this assembly. I'm going to have to ask you and your people to disperse." Eleanor's eyes narrowed as she gripped her cane tighter. "My father marched with Dr. King, Captain. I was beaten on the Edmund Pettus Bridge. You think I'm afraid of being arrested now?" The crowd fell silent as Eleanor took a single defiant step forward. The line of officers tensed. Mayor Richard Collins appeared at the top of the stairs, his expensive suit a stark contrast to the protesters' casual clothes. His face was flushed with anger. "Ms. Washington, this is your final warning. Your little stunt with those historical documents was illegal. Stand down now, or I'll have no choice but to have you arrested." Eleanor smiled, a calm settling over her features. She reached into her coat and pulled out a yellowed folder. "You mean these documents, Mayor Collins, the ones proving your family sold the land that was meant for our community center?" She held them up for all to see. "I think the people deserve to know the truth before you sign that development deal this afternoon." A collective gasp rippled through the crowd. Camera phones raised higher, live-streaming the confrontation. The mayor's face drained of color. "Captain Miller, arrest her. Now." As two officers moved toward Eleanor, her granddaughter Zoe pushed through the crowd, phone in hand. "It's too late, Mayor Collins. The documents are already online. Every news outlet in the state has them." But let's go back to how this all started. It was just 3 hours earlier when Eleanor Washington was sitting in her living room, surrounded by old photographs and newspaper clippings. The morning light filtered through lace curtains that Eleanor had sewn herself 30 years ago. Her modest home in the historically black neighborhood of Millwood was filled with memories, photographs of civil rights marches. Her late husband Robert in his postal uniform, their children's graduation pictures, and now grandchildren's artwork on the refrigerator. Eleanor sipped her coffee, the same brand she'd been drinking since 1972, as she carefully arranged newspaper clippings and photocopies across her dining table. The arthritis in her fingers made the work slow, but her mind was as sharp as ever. The phone rang, and Eleanor reached for her cordless, the kind with extra-large buttons her son had insisted she use. "Good morning, this is Eleanor," she answered, her voice warm but formal. "Grandma, it's Zoe. Are you still going through those old papers?" Her granddaughter's voice sounded concerned. "I certainly am, and I found exactly what I was looking for." Eleanor adjusted her reading glasses. "Deed transfer from 1968. The one Mayor Collins' daddy tried to hide." Zoe sighed. "Grandma, I know this community center means a lot to you, but going up against the Collins family and their development company, that's not just throwing pebbles at giants, it's trying to move mountains." Eleanor chuckled. "Child, I've been moving mountains since before you were born. Your generation has your hashtags and your tweets. Sometimes you need old-fashioned paper proof to bring down the powerful." "That's why I admire you," Zoe said, the smile evident in her voice. "But be careful. The vote on the development proposal is today at 3 p.m. What are you planning? You just make sure you're at City Hall with that fancy law degree of yours. I might need some legal backup." After hanging up, Eleanor carefully placed the documents in a manila folder. She looked at the framed photograph on her wall herself as a young woman in 1965, standing proudly beside her father at the march from Selma to Montgomery. Next to it hung her most prized possession, a handwritten note from Coretta Scott King thanking the Washington family for their dedication to the movement. "Time to finish what we started, Daddy," she whispered. The doorbell rang. Eleanor tucked the folder into her large handbag and made her way to the door, her cane tapping softly against the hardwood floors. Pastor Michael Thomas stood on her porch, his tall frame stooped slightly with age, but his smile as bright as when he'd first come to First Baptist Church in 1979. "You ready for this, Eleanor?" he asked, offering his arm. "Been ready for 50 years, Michael," she replied, locking her door. They walked slowly to Pastor Thomas's old Buick, the same car he'd been driving since the early 90s. As they settled in, the radio played Aretha Franklin's Respect. "That's a good sign," Eleanor said, tapping her fingers to the beat. Meanwhile, across town in the gleaming glass offices of Collins Development, Mayor Richard Collins was meeting with his son, David Collins, the company's chief executive. "The council vote is just a formality," Richard said, straightening his tie in the reflection of the floor-to-ceiling windows. "We've got 7 of the 9 votes locked down." David, younger but with the same commanding presence as his father, nodded. "The Millwood Plaza project will put this town on the map. Luxury condos, high-end retail, office space. It's exactly what we need to attract new investment." "What about the community center proposal?" asked Jessica Chen, the company's marketing director. "There's been a lot of pushback from the Millwood residents." Richard waved a dismissive hand. "Ancient history. That land was promised for a community center back in the 60s, but times have changed. The city needs tax revenue, not another drain on resources." "Besides," David added, checking his expensive watch, "who's going to stop us? A few old-timers with fond memories. This town needs to look forward, not backward." Jessica wasn't convinced. "I've been monitoring social media. There's a group organizing a protest at the council meeting. Eleanor Washington is leading it." Richard's smile faltered. "Eleanor Washington, she's got to be pushing 80 by now." 70, Jessica corrected, "and still sharp as a tack. She was a paralegal for the NAACP Legal Defense Fund before she retired." "Paralegal," Richard scoffed. "Not a lawyer, not someone with any real power." "Don't underestimate her," Jessica warned. "She's well-respected and people listen when she speaks." David checked his phone. "We should head to City Hall. I want to be there early to greet the council members." As they gathered their materials, Richard pulled his son aside. "Make sure those old deed documents stay buried. If anyone starts asking questions about how my father acquired that land." David nodded, understanding the unspoken concern. "Don't worry, Dad. Some things are better left in the past." At the Millwood Community Church, a group of residents had gathered. Many were senior citizens who had lived in the neighborhood their entire lives, alongside younger family members and allies. They made signs and prepared for the council meeting. Marcus Johnson, a former high school history teacher now in his 60s, addressed the group. "Today isn't just about a building. It's about promises made to our community after the riots of '68. It's about holding power accountable." A young woman raised her hand. "My grandmother talks about the riots, but I've never heard the full story." Marcus nodded solemnly. "After Dr. King was assassinated, cities across America erupted in pain and anger. Our neighborhood suffered greatly. When the smoke cleared, city leaders promised renewal, including land set aside for a community center. That land has sat empty for decades, and now the Collins family wants to build luxury condos no one in this neighborhood could ever afford." "We don't have proof of those promises," someone pointed out. "Eleanor Washington says she does," Marcus replied, "and if Eleanor says she has proof, you can take that to the bank." As if on cue, Pastor Thomas's Buick pulled up to the church. Eleanor emerged, her dignified presence causing the crowd to quiet down respectfully. "Brothers and sisters," she began, her voice carrying across the church yard. "Today we fight not just for a building, but for our history, our dignity, and our future." She held up the folder. "I have here the original deed transfer signed by Mayor Collins' father, Samuel Collins, explicitly designating that land for community use in perpetuity. They've been claiming that no such document exists. Well, they're about to learn that some of us don't just remember history, we kept receipts." Eleanor's face hardened. "They're trying to shut us out." She turned to Pastor Thomas. "We need to get to City Hall now." While Eleanor and the Millwood residents rushed to City Hall, Mayor Collins and the council members were already gathering in the meeting room. "The community center advocates are planning something," Richard told Councilwoman Patricia Alvarez, one of his most reliable supporters. "That's why we moved public comments to the beginning. Let them have their say, then we proceed with the vote as planned." Patricia looked uncomfortable. "Richard, some of my constituents are raising concerns about this development. The lack of affordable housing units." "We've been through this," Richard interrupted. "The tax revenue from this project will benefit the entire city. We can't afford sentimentality." Council chambers were nearly empty as the meeting was called to order, exactly as the mayor had planned. Only a handful of citizens, mostly developers and business owners with a stake in the project, were present. "We'll now open the floor for public comments," announced the council secretary. "Speaker will have 2 minutes." Richard checked his watch and smiled. The Millwood protesters were nowhere to be seen. The first few speakers were all in favor of the development project. Just as the public comment period was about to close, the chamber doors burst open. Eleanor Washington entered, slightly out of breath but standing tall, followed by Pastor Thomas and a stream of Millwood residents. "Madam Secretary," Eleanor called out, "I believe citizens have the right to address their government." We request time to speak." The secretary looked to the mayor, who reluctantly nodded. Eleanor made her way to the podium, the folder clutched in her hand. The chamber had suddenly filled with people, many recording on their phones. "Mayor Collins, council members, I am Eleanor Washington, a 50-year resident of Millwood. I'm here to present evidence that the land you're voting to sell to Collins Development was legally designated for community use." She opened the folder and pulled out the yellowed document. This deed transfer from 1968, signed by Samuel Collins after the unrest following Dr. King's assassination, clearly states that this land was to be held in trust for the Millwood community. Murmurs spread through the chamber. Richard Collins rose to his feet. "Ms. Washington, the city has no record of such an agreement. If this document were authentic, it would be in the city archives." Eleanor smiled. "It was in the archives, Mayor Collins, until approximately 1986 when your father became mayor. Fortunately, my late husband Robert worked at the county recorder's office. He made copies of important documents affecting our community." She gestured to Pastor Thomas, who distributed photocopies to the council members. Richard's face flushed. "This is irregular and inappropriate. These so-called documents haven't been authenticated." "Actually," came a voice from the back, "they have been." Zoe Washington, elegant in her attorney's suit, walked forward. "I'm Zoe Washington, representing the Millwood Community Association. We had these documents examined by a forensic document specialist. They're authentic and legally binding." The council chambers erupted in conversation. Richard banged his gavel repeatedly. "Order! This meeting will come to order." When the noise subsided, Richard spoke with forced calm. "These allegations are serious and require investigation. However, they do not change today's agenda. We will proceed with the vote on the development proposal." Eleanor's voice cut through the tension. "Mayor Collins, if you proceed with this vote knowing these documents exist, you'll be in violation of state law regarding disclosed encumbrances on public land transfers." The mayor's face darkened. "Ms. Washington, you're out of order. Your time has expired." "The truth doesn't expire, Mayor," Eleanor replied, her voice carrying across the chamber. "And neither do promises made to communities that have been marginalized for generations." David Collins approached his father, whispering urgently. The mayor nodded, then addressed the council. "In light of this new information, I move that we table the vote until these documents can be properly reviewed by the city attorney." Councilwoman Alvarez quickly seconded the motion. Eleanor knew this was merely a delay tactic, not a victory. As the meeting adjourned, she overheard David Collins on his phone. "Get the papers from my father's storage unit. All of them. We need to know what else might be out there." Eleanor turned to Zoe. "They're going to try to bury this again. We need to make sure these documents are seen by everyone." Zoe nodded. "I've already scanned them. One social media post and they'll be everywhere." "Not yet," Eleanor cautioned. "First, we need to speak with someone who was there when these promises were made. Someone besides me." "Who?" asked Zoe. Eleanor's eyes narrowed. "Walter Collins, the mayor's uncle." While the Collins family had dominated local politics and business for decades, Walter Collins had been the family outcast, the liberal brother who'd chosen teaching over real estate development. Now in his 80s, he lived in a modest retirement community on the edge of town. "Are you sure he'll talk to us?" Zoe asked as they drove to see him. "Walter and I served on the school integration committee together in the 70s, Eleanor replied. "He was always the conscience of the Collins family, much to his brother's dismay." Walter Collins's apartment was filled with books and jazz records. When Eleanor and Zoe arrived, he welcomed them warmly, his tall frame stooped with age, but his blue eyes still bright with intelligence. "Eleanor Washington," he said, embracing her. "Still fighting the good fight, I see." "Someone has to, Walter. Your nephew is trying to erase history again." Walter sighed heavily and gestured for them to sit. "The Millwood land, I wondered when this day would come." "We found the deed documents," Eleanor explained. "But Richard is already moving to discredit them." Walter nodded slowly. "My brother Samuel was not a bad man, Eleanor. After the riots, he genuinely wanted to make amends. Community center was his idea, a place for youth programs, job training, senior services. But as years passed and development money started flowing in, he changed his mind," Zoe finished. "Money has a way of reshaping principles," Walter said sadly. "When Samuel became mayor, he had those documents removed from public record. I objected, and that was the beginning of our estrangement." Eleanor leaned forward. "Walter, would you be willing to sign an affidavit confirming this history? And would you speak publicly if necessary?" The old man was quiet for a long moment. "The Collins family has been divided for too long by money, by politics, by moral compromises. Perhaps it's time for truth." He looked up, determination in his eyes. Yes, Eleanor, I'll stand with you. With Walter's affidavit in hand, Eleanor and Zoe returned to Millwood to plan their next move. The community had gathered at First Baptist Church, discussing strategy. The mayor has only tabled the vote, Marcus pointed out. He'll find a way to discredit these documents. Not if we go public first, said Zoe. We release the documents online along with Walter Collins's affidavit, then hold a press conference on the steps of City Hall. Pastor Thomas nodded approvingly. A public reckoning, it's long overdue. Eleanor, however, was thoughtful. Before we do that, I want to give Richard one chance to do the right thing. Not for his sake, but for this community. Less conflict, more reconciliation. Grandma, do you really think he'll listen? Zoe asked skeptically. Probably not, Eleanor admitted, but I've learned over 70 years that offering redemption matters even to those who don't deserve it. That evening, Eleanor called the mayor's office and requested a private meeting. To her surprise, Richard agreed to see her at City Hall the following morning. The next day dawned clear and cool. Eleanor dressed carefully in her best suit, the one she'd worn to her retirement celebration from the NAACP in 2010. Pastor Thomas drove her to City Hall. Want me to come in with you? He asked as they arrived. Eleanor shook her head. Some conversations need to happen one-on-one. Mayor Collins was waiting in his office, a spacious room with photographs of him shaking hands with governors and senators. He stood as Eleanor entered but didn't offer his hand. Ms. Washington. I've granted you 15 minutes. Eleanor sat without being invited. That should be sufficient, Mayor Collins. I've come to offer you a choice. Richard raised an eyebrow. A choice? Yes, you can continue fighting this battle and lose not only the development project but possibly your career, or you can choose a new path, one that honors past commitments while still allowing progress. The mayor scoffed. And what might this magical solution be? Eleanor pulled out a folder different from the one containing the deed and placed it on his desk. These are plans developed by the Millwood Community Association, with help from urban planners and architects who donated their time. A mixed-use development that includes the community center promised to us, along with affordable housing, retail space, and yes, some market-rate condominiums. Richard opened the folder reluctantly, scanning the documents inside. The Collins Development Company would still be the primary contractor, Eleanor continued. The profit margin would be smaller, but the community support would be unanimous. No protests, no legal battles, no scandal about your father's buried promises. Richard's jaw tightened. And if I refuse? Then at noon today, we hold a press conference. We release the documents, along with your Uncle Walter's affidavit describing how your father deliberately concealed them. The story writes itself, a powerful family hiding inconvenient truths to profit at the expense of a historically disadvantaged community. The mayor stood abruptly. This sounds like blackmail, Ms. Washington. No, Mayor Collins, this is accountability. Eleanor rose to her feet as well, leaning slightly on her cane. Your father made a promise to our community during a time of national trauma. You have the opportunity to fulfill that promise while still moving the city forward. It's not about winners and losers, it's about healing old wounds. Richard turned to look out his window. Below, he could see people gathering, Millwood residents preparing for the press conference if the meeting failed. My father believed in this city, he said quietly. So do I, Eleanor replied. That's why I've spent my life fighting for it to live up to its promises. After a long silence, Richard turned back. I'll need to discuss this with the development team. Of course, you have until noon. As Eleanor walked out of the mayor's office, Zoe was waiting in the hallway. How did it go? She asked anxiously. He's considering it, Eleanor replied. But we proceed as planned, start setting up for the press conference. The hours ticked by with no word from the mayor's office. By 11:30, a sizable crowd had gathered on the steps of City Hall, along with local news crews alerted to the possibility of a major announcement. Eleanor sat on a bench nearby, conserving her energy. Pastor Thomas joined her. No response? Eleanor shook her head. I had hoped. She didn't finish the thought. At 11:45, David Collins emerged from City Hall and walked directly to Eleanor. His face was unreadable. Ms. Washington, my father would like to speak with you and your granddaughter, privately. Eleanor and Zoe followed David back inside to a small conference room where Mayor Collins waited, along with Jessica Chen and 2 city council members. Ms. Washington, the mayor began formally, we've reviewed your proposal. Eleanor waited, her expression neutral. While we find some aspects challenging, we recognize the validity of your historical claims. Richard looked uncomfortable but continued. I've discussed this with the council members present, and we're prepared to support a modified version of your plan, one that honors the original commitment to a community center while allowing for development that benefits the entire city. Zoe began to smile, but Eleanor remained cautious. "What modifications are you suggesting?" Jessica stepped forward with a revised set of plans. "We've adjusted the ratio of affordable to market-rate housing and expanded the retail footprint. The community center remains central to the design with dedicated funding for programming." Zoe examined the plans critically. "The affordable housing component is still smaller than we proposed." "Significantly larger than in our original plan," David pointed out. "This is a compromise, Ms. Washington." Eleanor studied the revised proposal carefully. It wasn't everything they'd asked for, but it honored the core promise, the community center, and provided genuine benefits to Millwood residents. "If we accept this compromise," she said finally, "we would need legally binding commitments. No more lost documents or conveniently forgotten promises." "Of course," Richard agreed quickly. "All terms would be formalized in a development agreement approved by the full council with the Millwood Community Association as a signatory." Eleanor looked to Zoe, who gave a subtle nod. "Then I believe we have the beginning of an understanding, Mayor Collins." Richard extended his hand. After a moment's hesitation, Eleanor shook it. "There's still the matter of the press conference," Richard said. "People are gathered, expecting an announcement." Eleanor smiled. "Indeed they are. Shall we give them one?" Minutes later, Eleanor and Mayor Collins stood side by side on the steps of City Hall. The crowd fell silent in surprise at seeing them together. "Citizens of our great city," Richard began, his voice carrying across the plaza. "Today marks a new chapter in our community's story. After productive discussions with Ms. Eleanor Washington and the Millwood Community Association, I'm pleased to announce a collaborative approach to the Millwood Plaza development." As the mayor outlined the compromise plan, Eleanor watched the faces in the crowd's surprise giving way to cautious optimism among her neighbors and confusion among the mayor's business allies. When it was Eleanor's turn to speak, she stepped forward with dignity. 50 years ago, a promise was made to the Millwood community, a promise delayed but not forgotten. Today, that promise will finally be fulfilled." She looked directly at the mayor. "Not through conflict, but through recognition that our city's future depends on honoring its past while making space for progress that benefits all citizens." The announcement was met with applause, though not everyone looked pleased. Eleanor noticed David Collins in particular seemed tense, whispering heatedly with some of the developers in attendance. As the crowd dispersed, Eleanor overheard David arguing with his father. "You're giving away millions in potential profit," David hissed. "All because some old woman found paperwork from half a century ago?" "No," Richard replied firmly, "because it's the right thing to do, something I learned too late in life." The next morning, Eleanor sat on her porch watching the sunrise, a habit she'd maintained for decades. Her phone rang, Zoe calling to check in. "The news coverage is overwhelmingly positive," her granddaughter reported. "The mayor's approval ratings have actually gone up. Turns out compromise can be good politics." Eleanor smiled. "Compromise born of truth, Zoe. That's the key difference." "Walter Collins called me this morning," Zoe continued. "He's proud of what you accomplished, said it helped heal an old family wound." "One small step," Eleanor said. "This city has many wounds still in need of healing." "But it's a start," Zoe replied. "A real community center for Millwood, affordable housing, a seat at the table for future development." "That's all we ever wanted," Eleanor said softly. "A seat at the table and respect for our history." After ending the call, Eleanor picked up an old photograph, herself as a young woman standing beside her father at the original community center groundbreaking in 1969, full of hope for the future. The center had never been built, but the dream had survived. "We did it, Daddy," she whispered. 3 months later, ground was broken for the new Millwood Plaza development. Eleanor Washington stood front and center at the ceremony, golden shovel in hand, her family and neighbors surrounding her. Mayor Collins stood nearby, their former animosity replaced by a wary respect. As Eleanor pushed the shovel into the earth, she thought about the journey from that tense confrontation on the steps of City Hall to this moment of community triumph. It hadn't been easy. There had been more negotiations, more compromises, more moments when the fragile agreement nearly collapsed. But she had persevered as she always had, not just for herself, but for generations past and future. "This center will be named the Robert and Eleanor Washington Community Center," Mayor Collins announced, surprising Eleanor completely. "In recognition of their lifelong dedication to this community and to truth." Tears filled Eleanor's eyes as the crowd applauded. Zoe squeezed her grandmother's hand. "Your legacy, Grandma," she whispered. Eleanor shook her head. "Not mine, ours." Community's legacy. As the ceremony concluded, David Collins approached Eleanor. His attitude had softened over the months of working together on the revised development. "Ms. Washington, I owe you an apology," he said quietly. "I thought you were just an obstacle to progress. I didn't understand that real progress requires honoring the past." Eleanor studied the younger man. "It's never too late to learn that lesson, Mr. Collins. The question is, what will you do with it?" David looked thoughtful. "Been thinking about that. Would you be willing to serve on the Collins Foundation board? We're establishing a new grant program for historic neighborhood preservation." Eleanor laughed. "Are you sure you want a troublemaker like me in your boardroom?" David smiled. "I think that's exactly what we need." As the crowd dispersed and workers began preparing the site for construction, Eleanor remained, looking out over the land that had been promised to her community so long ago. Pastor Thomas joined her. "Full circle," he remarked. "Not quite," Eleanor replied. "A circle implies ending where we began. We're somewhere new now, somewhere better." She thought about the confrontation that had started it all, her stand on the steps of City Hall, facing down power with nothing but truth and determination. It seemed both long ago and just yesterday. "You know what I've learned in 70 years of fighting for justice," she said to her old friend. "What's that?" "That change happens in moments of crisis, when someone finds the courage to stand up and speak truth, no matter the consequences. But it only lasts when that truth leads to understanding rather than victory." Pastor Thomas nodded. "Not winners and losers, but healing." "Exactly," Eleanor said, watching as the first construction vehicles rolled onto the site. "That's the real legacy I want to leave, not just buildings or programs, but a community that knows how to fight for justice without losing its capacity for reconciliation." They walked slowly back toward the parking lot where Zoe waited to drive Eleanor home. "Will you join the Collins Foundation board?" Pastor Thomas asked. Eleanor smiled. "I believe I will. The work is never finished, is it?" "Not in this lifetime," her friend agreed. "But that's why we pass the torch." Eleanor glanced back at Zoe, who was deep in conversation with community members about programming for the new center. "The torch is in good hands," Eleanor said, "but I'm not ready to put mine down just yet." Now back to where we started. The crowd's angry voices rose to a crescendo outside City Hall. Eleanor Washington, her gray hair gleaming in the afternoon sun, stood resolute on the steps, facing down the police line that separated her from the mayor's office. Behind her, hundreds of protesters held signs demanding justice, their chants echoing off the marble facade. "You can't silence us anymore," Eleanor's voice carried across the plaza, powerful despite her 70 years. "50 years I've lived in this town, and I won't let you bulldoze our history." Police Captain James Miller stepped forward, his weathered face grim beneath his cap. "Ms. Washington, you don't have a permit for this assembly. I'm going to have to ask you and your people to disperse." Eleanor's eyes narrowed as she gripped her cane tighter. "My father marched with Dr. King, Captain. I was beaten on the Edmund Pettus Bridge. You think I'm afraid of being arrested now?" The crowd fell silent as Eleanor took a single defiant step forward. The line of officers tensed. Mayor Richard Collins appeared at the top of the stairs, his expensive suit a stark contrast to the protesters' casual clothes. His face was flushed with anger. "Ms. Washington, this is your final warning. Your little stunt with those historical documents was illegal. Stand down now, or I'll have no choice but to have you arrested." Eleanor smiled, a calm settling over her features. She reached into her coat and pulled out a yellowed folder. "You mean these documents, Mayor Collins? The ones proving your family sold the land that was meant for our community center?" She held them up for all to see. "I think the people deserve to know the truth before you sign that development deal this afternoon." A collective gasp rippled through the crowd. Camera phones raised higher, live-streaming the confrontation. The mayor's face drained of color. "Captain Miller, arrest her, now!" As two officers moved toward Eleanor, her granddaughter Zoe pushed through the crowd, phone in hand. "It's too late, Mayor Collins. The documents are already online. Every news outlet in the state has them." For a moment, time seemed suspended. Then something unexpected happened. Walter Collins, the mayor's elderly uncle, emerged from the crowd and slowly made his way to stand beside Eleanor. "Richard," he called to his nephew, "it's time for the Collins family to honor its promises." The mayor stared at his uncle in disbelief. The officers halted, uncertain. In that moment of hesitation, Eleanor saw something shift in Richard Collins's face, pride giving way to uncertainty, then resignation. Later, she would recognize it as the turning point, not just for the Millwood Community Center, but for healing decades of division in their city. "Stand down," the mayor said finally to the officers. Then, to the crowd, "Ms. Washington, let's continue this discussion inside. Bring your documents." As Eleanor Washington ascended the steps of City Hall, leaning slightly on her cane but walking with undiminished dignity, she felt the weight of history, both the painful past and the hopeful future resting on her shoulders. She had stood her ground when it mattered most, and in doing so, changed not just a development plan but the very power dynamics of her community. Behind her, the crowd began to chant her name. Not in anger now, but in celebration of a woman who had never stopped believing in the power of truth to overcome injustice, no matter how deeply buried or how long delayed. Truth has a way of rising, she thought to herself as the heavy doors of City Hall closed behind her. Even if it takes 50 years. Thank you for listening. If this story touched you, please subscribe and share your thoughts in the comments.